Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second installment in our three-part Technology and Practice webinar series to help you get started with Workspace Intelligence. So today we have Doug Demskis from the Domain Specialist team here to run through preparing for Microapps. So go ahead and take it away, Doug.
Thanks, Michelle. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining the second session here. Would like to welcome everybody, first and foremost, to the TIPS webinar series. And today we're going to talk a little bit about architecture and security from the Microapp services and the Workspace Intelligence feature set that is now available. So to get started, I've got a quick agenda. Just wanted to walk you through some of the items that we're going to cover, specifically around, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction, talk somewhat about strategy. I know you've heard this already, but we're going to give you a little bit of a primer. We're going to next discuss reference architecture, talk about some service components, processes, and some of the communication that happens between the different services. We'll then dive into a little bit of authentication and authorization, so how do users get logged into the system, where do things flow back and forth. And then we'll cover at a fairly high level some of the security things that you need to pay attention to as you get ready to implement Microapps into your environment. So one of the things that we start with from a strategy perspective is just redefining the employee experience with the Citrix Workspace. So the challenge that we have, as you may know, is that there's too many applications, things can be too complex, there's too much busy work. And where we're trying to guide customers, quite frankly, is through a solution that allows you to organize, guide, and automate the work for the employees. And as a result, you get some outcomes that come with that. The improved engagement, where users are going to leverage Workspace a little bit more instead of their existing systems of record or other places that they normally go in order to consolidate where work is done, sort of guide you through that process. As you go through that, you end up with increased productivity because you don't have to switch between applications, as you well know. And then through the automation process, we should see a higher employee lifetime value as a result, where the employees are happier to use the system. Things are a little more automated, they get a little more work done in a timely manner, and they're not context switching between different applications on a regular basis. So let's talk a little bit about what Workspace Intelligence has in it and some of the features that are available. So as you saw earlier during Peter's previous presentation, we talked a little bit about the unified and intelligent feed, user-initiated action, the Microapp builder, and then there's a couple other things that we'll kind of touch on towards the very end, which are available in Tech Preview, where there's a virtual assistant. We'll talk about some integration with Microsoft Teams, as well as an on-prem connector, where you'll be able to talk to systems of record that are internal on your own facilities, as opposed to sitting in the cloud. When we ship the product, there are several available systems of record and their integrations. So how can we connect to the different systems of record? And these are the ones that we're really looking at. So when I'm referring to system of record, really talking about SaaS applications, in this case being Jira, Google, Microsoft Dynamics, Power BI, Teams, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Tableau, Workday, Zendesk. Those types of things are kind of where we're focusing on. So as a quick refresher, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, if you forgot in the last since the last session, you'll see that the graphic all the way on the right-hand side of the slide is speaking about effectively the event-driven applications and sort of your intelligent feed that Peter spoke about earlier. And then over on the far right-hand side we're talking about user-initiated actions, and that's where users would actually click on a specific button to start a workflow or a process instead of having it sort of fed to them through their feed in the event-driven notification section. So we'll talk a little bit about the reference architecture and some data flows next. One of the things that we're looking to do is perform this concept of extract, transform, and notify. So we're looking to take, let's say, a record that comes from ServiceNow, something that changes like a notification, and categorize that into several different event types. So things like new, updated, untouched, deleted, etc. Take that data and then move it over to the workspace so the user can take an action upon it. That's really the whole concept here. We're really just looking to simplify the numbers of activities that happen within the systems of record, categorize them into event types, and then surface them in the specific customers or the user's endpoint, in this case being either a mobile device or within their workspace. So how does this occur, right? So there are several components that make up the specific Microapp service. So when we turn on the services, these are all the things that you'll get sort of underpinning the specific feature set when you click the tile that says, enable the Microapps. So we'll kind of just go through some quick terms. You'll hear me use these terms pretty much throughout the rest of the presentation. Some of them have some acronyms, and we'll start to introduce those as well. But kind of moving forward, you have a concept of a system of record, and that is really your source of truth, right? That's your application that you use on a regular basis. That's where your SaaS app lives. It is basically the particular application that we're going to be talking to. So we'll kind of call it either a system of record or an SOR. You'll hear me say that several times. Next, you'll have your data integration provider, and this is effectively the service that is going to talk to the system of record. You'll hear it also referred to as a DIP, just sort of its acronym. We'll also just basically call it a data integration provider sort of interchangeably. But this particular service is going to retrieve the configured data from the system of record, and it populates the Microapp data cache files. It's also going to update the system of record based upon what happens with the end user. So when the end user creates an action, it will go ahead and make sure that that record change is sitting in the system of record the way it's supposed to be. At the core of all of this is the Microapp service, and that service is responsible for configuring and exposing the Microapps to the subscribed users, and it has an event engine that basically generates the event-driven cards and feeds to be displayed to the user within their activity feed. Next, we have a credential wallet. This is where we are storing encrypted credentials for the users, combined with a combination of a resource account that is used to talk to the system of record. That is a read-only type of account. And then you'll have your OAuth accounts as well, which is something that the users will be bringing when they log into the system. So it's all done via OAuth, and that's used for read and write data as well. Next, you'll have your Citrix Analytics services as well, where it's going to create a target and a scored notification. It also shows productivity analytics, so how many times the card has been clicked on, what the user has done within the system, and starts to drive some of the engagement models that we talked about previously. And you'll hear more about that as we carry forward. The next, or lastly, you'll have the notification service. That is the service that is actually responsible for sending the cards and the data to the specific endpoints that the user is utilizing. So let's talk about a little bit about the system of record and how the synchronization happens. How do we actually get data from the system of record, and where does it go? So we'll start with a relatively simple diagram. There's basically 4 steps to it. So it all starts with the Microapp service. So the Microapp service is going to retrieve an encrypted service account from the system of record. So when you set this all up, which you'll see in the next tips webinar, kind of how this really gets put together within the builder. But there's several components there. But basically what happens is that the Microapp service is going to get that encrypted service account. It gets it from the system of record. It's going to put that data inside of the credential wallet, and then it's going to request a sync from the data integration provider. So it's basically just using the credential wallet to store its resources accounts, and then it will call out to the system of record and asking, basically through an API, it's going to ask system of record for data. That data integration provider is going to decrypt the service account credentials. The data integration provider is going to then retrieve those, the data from the system of record. So we're just basically sending it the secret key back and forth, and that gets all set up from the system of record. And then the data integration provider is going to stream the system of record data to the Microapp service to be put into a cache file. So there's actually 2 cache files in this particular system. The first one is effectively a full sync cache file. So it's basically the data that we're going to require to run the Microapp, and it's not absolutely everything inside of the system of record, it's just parts of it. So what happened is basically we would go to the system of record, we'd pull down the data, we'd store it in a cache file, and that's your first full sync that happens. Effectively, that is the baseline that of data that we use to determine whether or not changes need to get made. The next part of that is an incremental sync. That's a separate cache file. They do sit basically side by side. We'll talk a little bit about where they sit. And then from there, we use a differential between the 2 particular cache files to determine when something changes. We'll talk a little bit about how that works later down in the session. So the event-based Microapp notification. So how does a user basically get notified that something has changed, right? So in this case, the Microapp service processes the data cache, and based on the configuration events that comes through Citrix Analytics, the analytics system then will target the scored notification and send the notification event to the end user. In this case, the endpoint is going to retrieve that notification. So pretty straightforward. And you'll see the little graphic in the bottom corner, left-hand side, will basically say that there's a new expense report, and you'll see the data that's inside of it. This data can be tuned. We'll talk a little bit towards the latter part of the session as to how that can be done. But you'll see right now what it looks like is, it can offer a decent amount of information that shows you what you're going to need in order to make an action or make a decision, whether you're going to accept something or send it back or approve or reject, what have you, depending on the type of scenario that you're dealing with and the workflow that you want to enable. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the end user action. What happens upon notifications? When the user actually gets a notification, what happens, right? So the endpoint's going to retrieve the data from the Microapp service, and it's going to basically render those details within inside of the card that I showed you a minute ago. The user is then going to effectively invoke an action from the Microapp. The service is going to retrieve that action. It's going to retrieve the data from the OAuth tokens as the user had logged in. It gets those from the credential wallet. And it sends that action to the data integration provider. The data integration provider then will decrypt the user's OAuth token stream, and then we'll send it over to the system of record for it to be enacted upon. Data integration provider is then also going to write that action to the system of record under the identity of the end user. So it's not coming from a specific resource account that needs to connect to the system of record. This actually works as if it is the real user. It is the user's context. It is their permission structure that you're leveraging. And we are enacting that change on behalf of the user. And as a result, you don't have that sort of challenge where a resource account would be doing something in a headless fashion that the user didn't know about. The data integration provider then will read back the changed data, and it will update the Microapp service saying that the record was changed. The endpoint then is going to receive the feedback based upon the successful action and say that something was changed. You may be wondering what happens if the record was already changed ahead of time before the Microapp was actually occurring. So there's a process in there that actually will check to see if the record was already changed. And if it is, we won't make the change. If it, then we'll report that back in a log. If there's a scenario where the record was not changed, and this is what it would look like in most cases, we would go ahead and make that change, create the event log, and then we would make the change over to the system of record. That's how we basically make sure that we don't step on something that was already done in such a fashion where we could have any sort of corrupted type of data. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the security and controls that are available within the platform. And this is going to get a little more technical than I just showed you, but kind of bear with me for a minute. Try and keep it relatively high level. If there's any questions, you can ask them towards the end of the session. And there's other additional sessions that are going to be available throughout the online services that we've had over the past couple of months. So you'll see a little bit more detail on this. And if it's something you have questions on, we certainly can get them answered for you. So we'll start a little bit with a common security FAQ, right? So if you take a look at what we just went over, a lot of people start to come up with these questions about, okay, well, how did that all work? That was pretty high level. It doesn't give you a lot of detail. So we'll kind of go into it a little bit more. The first one we'll start with is sort of a data in flight principle. So data in flight is going to stay inside of that customer geo. So when you assign a specific Microapp service, let's say you turned it on inside of the Americas or APJ or EMEA, what have you, all that data is going to stay effectively in the customer geo. We're not going to bounce back and forth between the different geos. Once you've put that Microapp service, it's going to stay there. It is protected by TLS 1.2 using AES 256. So the data is in effect secured from that manner. The data at rest is going to be stored in the customer's geo within their cloud. We'll talk a little bit about how that's done as we move forward, but data doesn't really go too far from that perspective. It sits inside of an Azure SQL Server. The data sync interval that we have, when I talked about that sort of first full sync, that first full sync is actually done every 24 hours. It is tunable, so you can set a full sync to whatever you really want. The recommendation is about every 24 hours. And then the incremental sync that we spoke about earlier, that interval is, again, set anywhere from 24 hours to 2 minutes. We recommend about a 15-minute time frame just to make sure that the changes that get made get registered properly and that the system runs as optimally as it can. The read-only service account is, again, just used to read data, and it is the resource account that talks to the system of record. All we're really doing with that account is reading, right? We're not doing anything else. And then any updates or writes to the system is done under the user's identity and the user's context using OAuth v2. Those credentials, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be stored inside of the Azure Key Vault, and then access to the admin console is going to be controlled via Workspace. So when the admins log into Workspace and they have access to the cloud consoles, they'll have a tile in there that says manage my microapps, and the microapp builder will be in there. So any sort of context that happens from a admin perspective will all be tracked via the Workspace logs. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the protection of customer data at rest. This kind of comes up quite a bit, but we'll start with the different services sort of in the top left corner, where the notification service, the data at rest there, is configurable, right? Basically that card data, as I showed you a minute ago, kind of what sits in there, that is configurable. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the database that houses that is a multi-tenant database. It has a customer partition that's assigned to each individual customer. It's encrypted at rest with a multi-tenant encryption key that's handed by us to each one of the tenants when the system is created and stood up for the customer. The Microapp service, the data at rest, in this case, it's per system of record, and basically the database is a single tenant Azure SQL database that has an encryption level keys that is basically set specifically for that database. The credentials automatically are rotated every 24 hours, so we would apply the credentials to that specific instance, and when it goes to cycle every 24 hours, we're just going to automatically generate a new key. We don't know what that key is. It's not something that the customer even knows, quite frankly. It's just set up by the system when the system is instantiated for the first time. The data integration provider really has no record of any sort of data. It just has a pass-through back and forth. As you saw earlier, kind of what it does. The next part is really the Citrix Analytics. The data at rest is really going to store the user intelligence and the scoring data. So that's kind of what sits in there. And then the database in this case is a multi-tenant database as well with a customer partition dedicated specifically for the customer. It's encrypted at rest with a multi-tenant encryption key that's dedicated for the customer as well. The credential wallet is also one of those items that as you saw earlier, it does store encrypted service account credentials and the encrypted OAuth tokens. That database is a multi-tenant database with a customer partition, again, encrypted at rest with a multi-tenant encryption key, and it uses a cloud KMS for that model to be encrypted properly. Next, we want to talk a little bit about sort of multi-geo considerations. So what happens when we have multiple geographies? Where does the Microapp service need to live? What happens when you fire up the service for the first time? In this case, the customer, being yourselves, would choose the specific geo that you want to have the service onboarded in. So as you're starting up cloud services, you have the options between effectively US, EMEA, and APJ, or APS in some cases. That system of record is really going to be determined upon where it lives for you in your use case. So if you are an EMEA customer and you happen to use Workday, if you had your instance of Workday inside of the EMEA control plane, it would live in that spot, right? We wouldn't be asking you to change that because we would basically look to put the Microapp services in the same region. In this case, with most of our Americas customers, we'll have the same type of scenario where if they're using like Workday, ServiceNow, what have you, that control plane that was originally signed up for would be a scenario where, let's say, if we put the services inside of the Americas, then the Microapp service would live there. And the data always remains inside of the customer geo, both in flight and at rest, based upon the way that the structure is. It's all kind of combined within the geo framework, and we don't send traffic from, let's say, one geo into another. There's just no need to do so because of the way the system is set up. You have it dedicated specifically to you. We do have a scenario where we can have a customer have an on-premise system of record. So instead of being in the cloud, it would be effectively within your four walls of your data center. And there is something called an Appliance connector. I'll talk about that. It is available in Tech Preview. But basically what that's doing is that a customer in this case, we'll install the connector inside of any cloud or any data center of their choice. It doesn't have to align with any sort of cloud region or geo. And the gateway service is going to provide the network connectivity between the Microapp services, and you'll be sending traffic from the Microapp services in the cloud back to your on-prem services through that particular connector. The data in this case will always remain in the customer geo at rest, and then you'll just have the transport mechanism between the two systems. Again, it's available in Tech Preview, so you'll be able to see that relatively shortly. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the storage of the service account and the OAuth token. People have asked over time, okay, how are you storing actually the data when we get to building out the services accounts, and then what happens when the OAuth pieces kind of interact with the system. So the credential wallet is something that's an Azure service as well. It is a scenario where the credential wallet is going to retrieve the encrypted service account credentials for the systems of record. It does it for the resource account as well as the OAuth 2 token, so as I mentioned earlier. So we'll walk you through a little bit of a process flow, relatively straightforward. Sort of starting out with the Microapp service. That is the one that's basically going to call the credential wallet, and it stores the service account and the OAuth token with an ACL that's dedicated for the system itself. That ACL is going to specify whether or not the Microapp service is the authorized service in order to retrieve the secret. And the data integration provider is the service that is authorized to decrypt that specific secret. So they kind of a one-way for each specific scenario. The credential wallet is also going to call something called the trust service. It uses that in order to encrypt that value. It's almost like a, let's say like if you're familiar with Kerberos at all, it's sort of that same general principle. It's sort of that three-headed system where, you know, one can only do one thing, the other one can only do something else, in this case retrieve versus encrypt. The trust service is, in this case, then going to retrieve the customer-specific key from the Azure Key Vault. That trust service is going to encrypt the secret with the pertinent key, and that'll get stored inside of the Key Vault. Next, that trust service is going to return the encrypted secret over to the credential wallet, and the credential wallet is going to save the encrypted secret. So it's not something where we would end up seeing the passwords. I know we've had people ask that along the way. Once that password is entered into the system in the builder, it is something that is not replayable. If we wanted to make changes to it, we'd have to reset the system account completely within the system of record, re-enter in all the passwords. It would get resaved inside of the credential wallet. It's not something we can ever see. So it's secured from that perspective. Next, we'll talk a little bit about identity integration and what happens, you know, with the customer's identity. Where does it come from? This is from the user side, right? So if it's the kind of talking about the OAuth components, how does the user get their context? So the endpoints are going to authenticate to the Citrix Workspace platform, and as a result of doing that, the Workspace platform itself is going to have multiple ways to communicate from an identity provider perspective. It can either use a Citrix ADC, it can use Okta, it could use a Windows Active Directory, or it could use Azure Active Directory. Each one of those is effectively its own identity provider. So we'll leverage any one of those identity providers. In this case, you'll see in the slide, Windows Active Directory, obviously the most prevalent, Azure Active Directory, and then we sort of run into Okta if you had to stack rank them. But because of the way that we're having the user authenticate to Workspace, we already understand what their identity provider is, so we can leverage each one of these. So when you have the OAuth tokens that get replayed, it'll get replayed as a context of wherever your identity provider happens to be located. In this case, let's say it would be Okta or Azure Active Directory, what have you. So from an authentication and authorization standpoint, it's kind of a little bit of how it works. This diagram's a little more complicated probably than it needs to be, just because of trying to get it all on one slide. But the concept here is relatively simple, as I had described earlier. It's basically just leveraging your existing identity providers that are set up with inside of the cloud. In the event where you wanted to do, let's say, a stacked type of identity provider, you could do that as well. It requires a bunch of extra work to do so, but if you have a scenario where you have Azure Active Directory in one case or one system of record and it's not configured, let's say, for something else, like an Okta or what have you, and they're not fully integrated, we have the ability to send traffic in a couple different places by stacking the systems of record IDPs together. It's not an easy thing to do. It can be done. It depends a lot on what happens with the system of record and what it will use with its identity and what order it comes in. Some system of record will let you stack them, some will not. So just kind of get a rough idea of how that would work. In this case, the identity integration provider for that system of record is, again, using that service account for a read. It's also using the user context for writes. And the protocol that you're using is going to really depend upon that system of record. In most cases, we would recommend OAuth v2. There are some, if we're doing something really basic, it only has basic security. We probably wouldn't tell people to do that. But then you have the ability to do Windows security, or in this case, a proprietary auth for a system of record. The most common one being obviously OAuth v2. So the next thing I want to kind of quickly go through is sort of what happens from the OAuth perspective. Now that we've got the user logged into the workspace, how do we get the data exposed from the end user through their OAuth context, and what does that look like? So it's a fairly simple process. It's almost the reverse of how we got data into the credential wallet. It's just basically being replayed backwards. So instead of reading through all of this, I'll kind of just cover the highlights. You could certainly read through it, line by line if you need to. But basically, the Microapp service is going to go and call that endpoint to initiate the authentication process with the OAuth URL. Credential wallet, that's going to basically retrieve the encrypted secret, make sure that it's authorized and that the delegation and ACLs are correct. And then data integration provider is basically going to send that information back to the system. Credential wallet then asks the trust service to decrypt that encrypted secret that we had stored. Trust service then decrypts that secret using the per-tenant key. Again, it sits in Azure Key Vault. It's going to return that decrypted key back to the credential wallet. The credential wallet then is going to obtain the public key of the data integration provider via the trust service. It's going to decrypt that secret using the RSA key of the data integration provider. Credential wallet then is going to return the encrypted secret back to the Microapp service. That Microapp service is then going to be responsible for sending the encrypted key to the data integration provider. That data integration provider then uses the private RSA key to decrypt the secret, and the communication is sent over to the system of record, and will be able to transmit data on behalf of the user. So next I want to talk a little bit about some of the data controls that you have available within the platform. And the first thing that people want to understand is, okay, so we put data into a cache file. Where does it go, right? We talked about sort of where it lives within the Microapp service and the caches. But how do we control what sits inside of it? And the control is fairly variable depending upon the type of system of record and the fields that we're going to pull. In this case, you'll see a screenshot for ServiceNow. The scope of the active data for the out-of-the-box Microapp is really just basically pre-configured from the system to contain an entity in a field that's necessary to enable the use cases delivered by the Microapp. That's a lot of words there, but basically what we're looking at is that you have data that's displayed, that anything that's displayed on the Microapp blade or in virtual assistant response will be data that we would need. So we'd be using that from the system of record. Any data that's used by a search or a filter that needs to be applied, any data that's being used for like watched events, as we talked about a minute ago, or any data that's used during a notification process would all be something that we would need to get from the system of record. Now, if you note here too, we're not looking at things like a scenario where we need to, track, let's say, social security numbers or anything like that. We're only using data that is going to be available via the Microapp from the system of record that's built, sort of out of the box. And the need to process that particular type of data and know that workflow is really dependent upon the type of card output that you need, and any detailed levels would be needed to be understood by either the enterprise architect or the admin that sets up the system in order to effectively reduce the scope of the service account on a system of record. So the key here is to understand the workflow specifically for the end user and the Microapp to determine exactly what you want to do. And then to work with the enterprise architect to say, okay, for example, I need data from a system of record field, let's say like ServiceNow, where we need approval data. It's got to come from a specific place, and that may be the only place that we need to get that data from. And then the resource account that sets up early on in the system to talk to the system of record would need to have its permissions applied specifically to only get data from those specific sets of fields. Now, by default, out of the box, there's a lot of microapps that are available to you and will grab the data that is necessary to support all of those microapps. But it can be trimmed down and tuned and optimized in such a way where, let's say you didn't want to use all those microapps, you only wanted to use 2 or 3 of them. My recommendation there is, start the system, make sure that you're comfortable with how the microapps work. As you start to add to things, then understand kind of what you want to trim or optimize, because we've had scenarios where you'll automatically start to trim data out and then realize that you need to open it back up again, and that's change control and processing back with the enterprise architects and auditing and everybody else to make sure that we've opened things back up after they've already been locked down. So I would say to get started, it would be one of those scenarios where you want to kind of leave it alone, make sure that you get all the microapps working, and then you can start to trim that down as needed. In order to do that, again, you do have to know the workflow that you want to provide, but you do have the ability to remove columns from the specific database schemas. You can remove the entities that are being retrieved, basically to only the data that is needed for the specific microapp. You can also utilize a query filter on the table to reduce the scope of the data that's retrieved and stored inside of the microapp cache file, so that's how we'll trim the data down as well. You'll also have the ability to utilize a data filter on the entity in the field to reduce the number of, or the amount of data that's actually stored based on a calendar. So if you want to only keep 30 days worth of data inside of the cache file instead of more or less, what have you, you can trim that down. In some cases, we've had customers look to say, I only want to keep 10 days, 5 days, what have you, worth of data. There are certain scenarios to do each one of those things. I would say a good starting point would be about 30 days worth of data. But again, it's going to be dependent upon the use case and each individual customer's requirements. And this is something that you'd really want to work with your legal and security teams with to understand whether or not this is a scenario that applies to you and you need to apply the filter properly. I want to talk next a little bit about the analytics and the notifications that happen. So the content of that notification messages, they are configurable. As the cards pass through the Citrix Analytics service, you have the ability to reduce the notification data that's sent to the desktop notification and or the mobile device. So if you look at the 2 graphics that are on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll notice that the top one has basically the same data that we showed earlier, where this specific user had submitted an expense report for a large amount, and they have the option to either accept or send that back to the individual user that had filed the expense report. You have the ability to trim all of that data out to only basically show that you have an expense report and then you have a new one that needs to be approved, or it's awaiting for your approval. And then the scenario here, there are certain times and locations where you do not want to surface all of the data, such as like a mobile platform. Let's say you were in an airport or something. You really don't want somebody shoulder surfing and looking at your your approvals that you're doing. So maybe that's a good time not to have all the data in there. In some cases, most customers are looking to keep that data relatively small and just show something like, hey, there's a new expense report, and you have the ability to make a change or take an action on that. Now, this will change a little bit as you go into the workspace. So you have the ability to basically open up that specific action. It'll call out a big detail blade, which will have all the data inside of it if you want to click on it a little bit further, such as where you have the option to review. So you can choose to click on that. That'll open the rest of the data that you would need. But initially, when you saw that notification banner, you would not get all of that data. Again, it's configurable on a case-by-case basis. So next, what I want to talk about is what's new, right? What we mentioned a little bit about what is available or what's coming out in the tech preview, and we'll kind of just quickly go through that. As I mentioned earlier, there is a virtual assistant that is available for tech preview. It provides an immediate access to relevant content and business data. So it allows you to type in data or questions that are pre-formulated with keywords. It's all configurable by the admin, where you can say, how much PTO do I have? Show me my last set of expenses. And depending on how the system is set up, it will retrieve that data for you. It is a very powerful tool. It is something that does require some knowledge on how the system works and the type of queries that you want to make in order to preset some of those filters. But it is something that is starting to become very, very powerful within inside of the Workspace. So I certainly welcome you to check that out. Next, we have the ability to work with Microsoft Teams. So we have a scenario where we can send feed cards to the Microsoft Teams channels, or we can utilize the Citrix virtual assistants from within the Microsoft Teams. That's something that's going to be available, again, in Tech Preview, and you can certainly reach out to your salesperson or your CSM to get that enabled. And then lastly, we have the connector appliance for the cloud service. And this is the connector appliance that I was speaking about earlier that allows you to connect an on-prem system of record. Let's say it's a custom system of record, what have you. There's lots of options of how that would basically work. In this case, let's say it would be like on-prem Jira, for example. We can connect an on-prem Jira system to a Microapp that sits in the cloud using this type of connector. You'll hear it called a couple different things throughout the sort of discussions with each different individual person at Citrix, but it is called the connector appliance for cloud services. And again, it allows you to have that custom application connected to your network as a result of having that particular connector in place. It also does route that system of record traffic through your firewall. So you just have to make sure those rules are open to do so effectively. I've heard people say it's almost like a proxy, if you will. It just depends upon the type of scenario, but it is really just that connector appliance that is doing that work for you. And that's all I have for today. Wanted to keep it short and sweet. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions as you go through this. But again, this is a bit of a primer on how the system works. It's not supposed to be an entire deep dive on what happens with credentials and things. It just gives you a rough overview of how this would work. And one of the things that is good for discussion as you start to get into this with your teams, you'll start to understand why you now need to speak with your legal teams, the change control folks, as well as some of the security team members that are in your enterprise in order to make this work. Because there's a lot that goes on here, right, as far as making sure that the system of record data is responding properly, but also the data that flows through that microapp. It's something that does require a team effort in order to make sure that we can implement it properly, and does require a bit of a guided install. And in the next follow-on session to this particular webinar, my colleague Peter Prose will talk to you a little about how to set up a generic system of record and what it would look like to configure some of these things directly with JSON, and he'll actually walk you through a little bit of the builder on how that's done. Well, thank you for attending, everyone. I would like you to feel free to type in some questions. I'm sure you have a few as you've watched the presentation. We will be taking a live Q&A session right after this, so myself and some of my colleagues will be on the line and happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Doug. And joining Doug in to help field the questions, we have Reggie Wang, Sue Wang, Greg Hayes, and Nick Holmquist, all from the Domain Specialist team. I'm here to help answer some questions. So first up, we have, how is data protected in flight versus at rest?
Hi, this is Renju Wang. I can answer that question. So data in flight is data actively moving from one location to another, such as across the internet or through a private network. And for data in flight, it typically stays in the customer's geo and is protected by TLS 1.2 plus. That's one of the typical transport layer security protocols that uses a combination of key exchange algorithms with secure hash algorithms to protect data in flight. And for data at rest, it's typically stored only in the customer's geo in Citrix Cloud. And there we use a combination of credential wallets and other security methods to protect the customer's data at rest.
All right, awesome. Next up, what data is stored in the cache?
Hi, everyone, this is Sue. So in regards to data that is stored in the cache, So generally during a integration of the system of record, you do a full synchronization, which generally pulls up to 30 days of data. From there, each incremental sync that occurs will sync the deltas or the changes in data, and there'll be two references to cache. So it'll be the initial full data sync cache, and then there'll be an incremental data sync cache, and the two information will cross-reference with each other, and from there it'll generate notification cards based upon changes in data or deletions and stuff like that.
All right, thanks, Sue. Next up, what is the minimum requirement for a service account?
Hi, this is Greg Hayes. So for service accounts, we prefer to keep those as read-only accounts where possible, so that we can limit the data that they are exposed to and the access that those accounts have. But again, it all depends on the system of record as well, depending on what they support.
Okay, perfect. And last but not least, unless we have some late questions coming in, but how do we ensure a user only has access to specific information through the Microapp service?
So this is Sue. So within the Microapp service, we have a subscription base to each Microapp. So depending on the admin's configurations, they can subscribe a user group, or they can subscribe all users depending upon the Microapp itself and who the group applies to. So this ensures that only specific individuals within that group or all of the users have access to their specific Microapp notifications that are coming on their activity feed.
And then within each Microapp, we can add personalization. So within a table page or a detail page, we can filter records for a specific user. So if a user owns an opportunity in Salesforce, we can show only the opportunities that they own. Or if they're responsible for an approval in Concur, we'll show only the approvals that they are expecting to act upon.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that we have coming in, but I'm sure as you get in there and play around with it a little bit more, more questions will pop up. So don't hesitate, take advantage of all the resources that we've put together. Make sure to sign up and check out our next in the 3-part series to dive a little bit deeper into configuring the environment. And then also, if at any point you have questions, always reach out to your customer success manager, or we even have some office hours set up where you can pop in and ask questions to the experts. So lots of resources available. I appreciate everyone. Hope you found this valuable. The recording will be available in about a week or so you can listen to it as many times as you want. All right, thanks everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.